This lecture will look at contemporary gaming from 2008 until the present, focusing specifically on the rise of eSports, the very influential series Metal Gear, and we will conclude by looking at MOGs, the massive multiplayer online games, especially that of World of Warcraft and EVE. Now, esports are a form of organized multiplayer video game competitions, particularly played between professional teams, whereby we have these individuals will compete, often being streamed live on such platforms as Twitch or viewed in stadiums by tens of thousands of people. Now, esports, importantly, we should note, have nothing to do with sports games, and they only recently have come into mainstream prominence. As a concept, esports can be traced all the way back to space war competitions that were held in the 1970s, and also the Atari-sponsored Space Invaders Championship of 1980 that attracted 10,000 participants. Now, there are Twin Galaxies record-keeping arcade high scores as well, whereby people would compete to see who had the highest score. With this being said, the new millennium brings about a change in this type of venue where we have international tournaments with leagues setting players against each other on a regular basis now. The Deutsche Klungliga, founded in 1997, is the first example of such leagues that would eventually become the Electronic Sports League, or ESL, in 2000. In the same year, we find the World Cyber Games Tournament would also be held at Seoul in South Korea. And then in 2002, we have the founding of the Major League Gaming, or MLG. Thus, we have organizations like the NFL or MLB that oversee gaming like any other professional sport. Now, outside of South Korea, gaming was never really, as an esport that is, considered an attractive prospect for television, as we would watch basketball, football, or baseball games in America, for instance. But sites like YouTube and Twitch were able to reach a much wider audience. Thus, we did not need to broadcast on network television. Now, Twitch was crucial for allowing spectators to watch tournaments live. In 2013, for instance, 45 million viewers per month watched, with 6 million broadcasts per month, an amazing number of these broadcasts and gameplay. In 2013, the League of Legends World Championship final was watched by 8.5 million people, to give you an example of the scale of this worldwide. It became so popular and so lucrative that Amazon acquired Twitch for just under $1 billion. Now, the first phenomenon for esports comes in the form of Blizzard's StarCraft, released in 1997, a real-time strategy game with the scale of the industry seen here with this, created in South Korea, still being a benchmark for esports. There were 9.5 million of these sold, with 4.5 million copies in South Korea alone, with a population of 50 million, to give you an idea of how many people bought this game. Now, South Korea is a nation perfect as a cradle for esports. They had at the time the most advanced broadband infrastructure on the planet, the highest speeds of any developed nation. And the game was released at a time in which there was mass youth unemployment. For in 1998, there was the Asian financial crisis. The most popular pastime, because they did not have jobs, was to hang out in a PC bong or a net cafe to play games. So we find that StarCraft remains a competitive draw for players and spectators alike for several reasons, notably its complexity, for it balances 3 asymmetric races and tests a wide range of skills, and has an enormously high skill ceiling when we discuss how the game is actually played. Now, professionals can execute, for instance, 300 to 400 actions per minute with as little redundancy as possible. The general principles of the game are as follows. Most players will specialize in one of 3 races, and you will start the match spawning with a central base structure and some workers. Immediately, these workers are put to the task of collecting minerals, constructing more workers from the central base, and shortly start building other structures. At the same time, we would now have various tech trees that would result in different kinds of armies being created, and you would try to tailor your army to counter your opponent's army. Now, we already find at this stage a professional playing the game is already juggling the economy or the worker force, the production of munitions such as the army, and then scouting out different areas to map out where the opponent is. Of course, all of this is done without seeing what the other player is doing, so there's quite a bit of mind games associated with playing this. Now, Korean professionals, in order to be competitive, practiced up to 60 hours a week, and there was emphasis in their competitions on execution instead of mind games, with the belief that you can only go so far in trying to outwit your opponent, but you can always outproduce them with a bigger army. That's how you almost always win at StarCraft. The process of playing is much like being a general overseeing a battlefield while also managing munitions and factories and also fighting on the front lines all at the same time. So multitasking does not even begin to explain how difficult this is. So not surprisingly, the most popular players are celebrities in Korean society. Lim Yo-hwan, for instance, played as Slayer's boxer, nicknamed the Emperor by the people of South Korea, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and had a fan club with nearly 500,000 members. As the most popular video game genre in the world currently, it's not surprising that for eSports, the first-person shooter is also ever popular. Now here we have the premier title, Counter-Strike, which was remade 3 times and is a very popular esport, designed by the Valve company. This pits 2 teams of 5 players against each other. You can either play as a team of terrorists or counter-terrorists, and you would switch your role after 15 rounds. An entire match would have 30 rounds total. The teams have access to slightly different equipment, and the maps are asymmetrical as far as the locations, which is a divergence from the normal first-person shooter, which values symmetry. Each round has the terrorists winning by planting a bomb at one of 2 potential sites, and this starts a countdown. The counter-terrorists win if they defuse the bomb before it goes off. Obviously, if either team kills all 5 of the others, then there's an automatic win. Now, this is a precision shooter game with each gun having a distinct recoil, and of course, because it's precision, firing while you're moving is entirely and incredibly inaccurate. But as always with first-person shooters, a headshot is an instant kill. You find that players very often will wear Kevlar, thus of course you can take multiple rounds if you were going to shoot them in the mass of the body. Now, there is a rhythm to each match because each team is awarded money at the end of each round based upon the number of kills that they had and whether or not they won or lost. As you can see here, there's money above each character's head. The teams then are forced often into an economy round if they lose with a basic pistol and no Kevlar vest, and they have to buy less than ideal weapons as part of this round, desperate to get back on track. This creates a metagame over and above the second-to-second headshots that make up the game. Instead of just a short round of chasing down another team, you now are thinking of a sequence of different scenarios. And of course, professionals who play dozens of hours a week would memorize the maps in each level, so they would know where everything is, how the players would move or likely move through each level, the best hiding places, the best routes, and so on. Now, the most recent esports sensation is the multiplayer online battle arena games. These, as an example here by Riot Games in 2014, disclosed that they had 65 million unique players per month for the League of Legends, released in 2009. We will also discuss Valve's Dota 2 of 2013. Now, this is based on a mod for Blizzard's Warcraft 3 of 2002. Now, the gameplay of a MOBA, or a multiplayer online battle arena game, pits two teams of 5 champions against one another on a large map bisected with 3 lanes between each team's home base. Both teams have a small army of AI monsters called creeps who will push forwards, and a series also of defensive towers on their half of the lane. The goal of League of Legends is to destroy the enemy team's base, but the game itself is to level up your champions as fast as possible by landing killing blows on enemy creeps and other champions. This, of course, grants experience points and gold. The MOBAs are infinitely complex games due to the sheer number of champions from which to choose, and range of items that you can buy in the game, with an in-depth and unexpected strategies used by each team with 5 different personalities. Now, League of Legends, for instance, offers 120 champions from which to choose, while Dota 2 has 108, each with their own leveling arc and particular specialization. Therefore, the drafting process, much as you would have with any professional league, before the game is also very competitive, for teams will alternate between choosing one hero, thus of course banning that choice from the other team. It is a very complex process and confusing for outsiders. It looks seemingly messy as a spectacle, and is part of the reason for its appeal to the initiated, those who know what's going on. Now, we don't need widespread appeal for television or network television broadcasts, because these events are broadcast again straight to enormous audiences through YouTube or Twitch that offers a multi-million-dollar prize pools and attracts very serious sponsorship. We already find that these events are held in huge stadiums with crowds of tens of thousands of people. So soon, we're going to see these will become professional sports like any other. Switching gears now, we will look at Hideo Kojima's very influential Metal Gear series, one of the longest running series in video game history, beginning in 1987. Released on the MSX2, we find that the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful series is often hailed by fans as the greatest game ever. Now, Hideo Kojima is a lead designer of this series and leaves an indelible mark on it. We find that the series begins with a special ops soldier, Solid Snake, swimming to a dock entrance of a military base. This becomes one of the quintessential scenes that will dominate many of the later aspects of the series. Now, the first game seen here from 1987 looked like a top-down 2D shooter, but the idea was entirely new. What if we had a military game, not about fighting, but avoiding confrontation? Thus, we find that the goal of Metal Gear is not direct assault, but instead stealth. So we find here they single-handedly will create the stealth genre. Now, as in the original Metal Gear, guards would follow a set patrol route and would only react to Snake if, once again, they see him. Now, the main building is lavished as far as the attention to detail is concerned. Even seemingly trivial details are important. For instance, Snake has a pack of cigarettes that you can see very often down in the lower bar, whereby if he smokes them, it will reduce his health temporarily. He also has a radio that he can call in support from his team or advice. Now, Kojima's obsession starts here in 1987 with Metal Gear, relating to fourth wall breaks, whereby the game is obsessed with talking to and talking at the player. So by drawing attention to the fact that it is a game and there are certain limitations. So, for instance, near the end with Big Boss, Snake's commander, it even states switch off your MSX at once, thus of course telling you that you should turn off your game console, breaking the fiction that you are playing and engaged with a game and pointing out the fact that it is a game. So this is the prototype for a classic in its embryonic state of ideas. It is obviously not a classic game yet, for it took 11 years for the technology to catch up with Kojima's vision. Now here we have Metal Gear Solid, released on the PlayStation in 1998, one of the most important games ever made for several reasons of what it brings to the genre and what it is going to introduce to video games in general. Now here we have high production values associated with the creation of the game, with the opening showing Snake approaching the base through water, much like the original. Now the camera changes angles as the commander delivers your mission briefing of what's about to happen. It is played in the third person, angled from the top down very often, and so you begin by exploring a loading bay that becomes the microcosm of the game. Patrolling guards in this have a vision cone, if you will, and they can see and hear Snake if, for instance, you splash through puddles, causing footprints to be left for the first few steps. The attention to detail, again, is incredible. One of the key aspects and successes with Metal Gear Solid is the use of CD-ROM media. Thus, of course, now using his radio, we have fully voiced acting and orchestral backdrops. The original radio now returns as a codec, where you get instructions and advice on current situations. The broad topics that are going to be discussed reflect that of Kojima's own wide-ranging topics. For instance, his comrades will talk about Godzilla, local flora and fauna, Cold World paranoia, trends in military hardware, the nature of war, and even the interwoven thread of fate and genetics. Now, this is a very non-interactive way of creating a narrative in the world texture as it is going to evolve with Metal Gear Solid. But what is lasting about the game is the imagination and the variety of situations the player must face. So you must sneak past security guards and security cameras, leading to challenges that test the very limits of the game's mechanics. Boss battles, for instance, such as Vulcan Raven, a chain gun wielding mercenary, where avoiding detection is the key, leading him into virtual traps here. Kojima's interest in the fourth wall and playing with this idea of the player and his agency, or her agency, can be seen here with Colonel, that being Snake's boss, telling him to contact a fellow operative Meryl by using the codec frequency. But of course, there is no CD case in the game, so you must figure out that what he's talking about is the real-world package that the game came in. So if you look on the back, there's a screenshot of her specific frequency. Later, this can be seen as well with Snake being captured and tortured by Revolver Ocelot, who is told that there are no continues at this point, and to survive you must mash the controller button. But he also states, don't dare use auto-fire or I'll know, and of course he does. So we find that the characters are playing with the idea that they understand it's a game. The best example of this in Metal Gear Solid comes by the way of the boss character Psycho Mantis that exemplifies the entire series. As you begin the fight, he claims that he can read your mind. So if the player has a memory card containing saves of other games, Mantis will comment on their tastes and what types of games you were playing. It also talks about your playing style, how many soldiers you've killed, and alerts you've triggered, talking about how clumsy you might be if you keep triggering alerts. So this would tell the player then also to put the controller on the floor, and it uses the rumble feature to make it move as the screen flashes between angles. The TV then switches to a video mode, but then misspelled Hideo. So at the beginning, we find he flies around the room, avoiding all of your attacks. And the only way to get around it is to eventually figure out you have to unplug the controller and reinsert it into slot 2. But once you figure this out, once again, we find that the boss has another trick up his sleeve. He has Meryl shoot herself. So the only way you must figure out how to keep her from doing this is to put your gun away and then knock her out. So the fourth wall infatuation is showcased here in this bravura performance, which is much more than a mere novelty. Because of this, Metal Gear Solid would be a phenomenal success and raise the bar for the presentation of narrative in games in general. Its intricate take on the military-industrial complex and the role of genetics and how it plays in with fate and free will are also going to be revolutionary. For instance, Snake is actually a clone of America's Greatest Soldier, so therefore we're asking the question, is he fated to follow in the footsteps of his genetic father? This is a quantum leap for action games, and in the series moving forward, we see it needs to be reinvented with each sequel. Now, it is unique in the sense that in sequels with video games, we find that many of them are going to base their entire identity and franchise around this. So video games in the industry, at the big budget end at least, are based around sequels much like Hollywood movies are. But unlike movies that often diminish the original and are played out by the third or fourth installation, games are in a very different circumstance and context because the technology is constantly improving in very concrete and visceral ways. Therefore, sequels offer the opportunity to improve, prune, and refine, and build on the set of the core mechanics which made the original game a success. So major third-party publishers have a reliable sequence of sequels as the bedrock of their business. Ubisoft, for instance, in the Assassin's Creed series is a juggernaut where we have the same character changing settings but sticking rigidly to a formula. At the same time, Activision has mastered the releasing of annual entries in its huge Call of Duty series. And we might state that EA's sports titles are the ultimate case study in incremental improvement. The same can be said with Metal Gear Solid 2, that lasted in the series much longer than any of the others we just mentioned. The sequel here is designed specifically to upset player expectations. The main tool that does this is the lead character Raiden, who is omitted from the game's promotional material in favor of the first hero, Snake. And it starts out with a short mission actually featuring Snake, so the player thinks that's who they're going to be playing. But Raiden then comes in shortly thereafter. There was enormous fan backlash because of this, but that's the point. We find that Raiden is eventually revealed to be a child soldier raised on virtual reality missions to emulate his hero, Solid Snake. So therefore, you're paralleling the player with, once again, Raiden, who throughout the game is constantly one step behind Snake, making rookie mistakes. The point here is driven home later on when Raiden reads his dog tags that he's wearing and finds the personal information that was input at the outset of the game by the player. In a symbolic moment, he then throws them away. The world at the latter part of the game begins to crumble as he is tortured, and he's told to switch off the game console now. They begin repeating lines from the original Metal Gear Solid, and the game itself seems to end, and a failed screen comes up, but instead of mission failed, it is misspelled fission mailed, and the game continues in the top right corner. The big reveal comes later on when Raiden is revealed to be the ultimate example of the US government's control, genetically engineered and taught through virtual reality systems. This mission that we have gone through deliberately paralleled Metal Gear Solid to create a soldier on par with Snake. At the climax, he fights Solidus, an ex-president of the United States, and his adopted father, and the leader of the game's antagonists. He learns, while talking to Solidus, that the setting that we've been playing in is actually an internet-controlled AI program designed to maintain America's military and cultural dominance through censorship. Solidus wants to destroy this program and end the cultural dominance of the US. This is going to emphasize the point here. For in video games, players have to follow a path designed for them, and any illusion of choice is just that, an illusion. So this also emphasizes your lack of choice. At the end, you receive a call to finish the game, and the only way to do that is to kill Solidus. Thus, you are protecting the censorship program and the very program that created you as this brainwashed child. Therefore, you have to do it because good soldiers and citizens obey. Now, the sequel is, of course, about problems of making a sequel. Kojima obviously didn't want to make a sequel, and so here this comes out. Should you make the same game again? Should you offer something different? Or do we even need to make a sequel at all? So the game's events here are merely a computer program, we find out, thus playing on the limitations of the player's agency and exposing them. Of course, you don't have the choice of what you can do and where you can go. Therefore, the message is quite clear. Though you may have free will, that doesn't mean you can change or deny reality. So the prequel with Metal Gear Solid 3 takes this to the next level and uses the mechanics to further emphasize stealth, stripping back much of the plot elements. The main character here is Naked Snake and echoes the first game's Solid Snake in appearance. So the rewards are appropriate here with camouflage that you're going to wear to sneak around in this jungle setting and slow movement. Now we find that Snake makes his way to the enemy base rather than starting there, which is quite novel for action games. And we should note that it is set in the 1960s Cold War era, so we have a much more spacious environment out here in the jungle. In earlier games, the guards had limited abilities, but now their eyesight and intelligence is radically improved. Thus, avoiding attention and detection becomes more of a priority, more so than ever. You survive out here in the jungle while you make your way to the base by catching and eating animals, and you change outfits to match the background. You perform surgeries on yourself, such as with a gunshot wound. Now, the attention to detail here is also quite amazing, for when you lose an eye, the right side of the screen dims when in first-person mode. So these very careful attention to detail is what the players were very interested in. In addition, there's consistent creativity with the boss battles. For instance, with The End, this old sniper, we find that we fight in a gigantic open arena instead of a closed space. And instead of a quick, bloody interaction engagement, which is more common for boss fights, we find this is designed to be played over hours and hours. So it's more realistic when it comes to a sniper battle, edging your way towards him inch by inch. So this rewards in the same way the type of mechanics that we saw that made the game popular previously. Now here we find the contradictory nature of Metal Gear Solid in general that anyone can appreciate. That being, it's a series. As it progresses, it becomes more prominent as a piece of video game culture and also more explicitly anti-military industrial complex and anti-war. This can be seen most clearly in The Sorrow, a boss battle with a ghost in waist-deep water in a river. So the ghosts here, of all the soldiers you've killed in the game, come back and try to grab you. Therefore, if you're bloodthirsty, you have more to contend with. More ghosts are coming at you. The Sorrow has no health bar, so you cannot harm this character. And if you twist up, you can catch a glimpse of Hideo Kojima and himself, showing his view on the anti-war sentiment and how war creates more monsters than it can possibly ever destroy. So the only way to escape in this boss battle is to die and then revive yourself with a pill. Now, at the end of the game, we have another question about agency, for we are confronted with Snake's mentor, the boss. She forces him to battle to the death, much like with Solidus, and at the end, you stand over her body, and the player is forced to pull the trigger to complete the game. After this, Naked Snake becomes Big Boss, the original antagonist in Metal Gear. Therefore, Metal Gear 2 will mock the player's agency and asks if they actually have control over what they're doing. Metal Gear 3 here mocks and questions human agency at all. Do you have free will, or are there circumstances that lead to the killing of your mentor that you have no control over whatsoever? So the big boss here then refuses to accept that soldiers should die for governments and instead becomes a rogue agent or a terrorist, explaining how his origin story came to be. Now, Metal Gear Solid 4 attempted to escape what the series had become. Now we have an aged Snake here brought back for his final mission, tying up the many loose ends in the series and saying goodbye to favorite characters. Now, because it was made to showcase the PS3's abilities, it is at the same time its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. For the visual detail and effects are incredible, but there are many non-interactive sections that detract from the game. Now, this is divided into discrete chapters, and all of them begin with a long cutscene of about 30 minutes. The premise here is that Solid Snake is on his last mission at Shadow Moses, the setting for the first game. But now it has been rebuilt 2 generations later with a more advanced technology. On the way to the compound, he reminisces about his past as a young Snake, whereby the music from the original plays, and you're exploring certain areas that remind you of conversations that start playing that you had years before. Now we find, however, that Shadow Moses is an empty ruin. There are no soldiers. There are rusty security cameras. So as we age, the point being, we begin to romanticize the past, and we want to revisit those places that made us, but it's impossible to truly go back. Thus, if we are to state that the Metal Gear series explores identity, in the second installation, we find this identity is questioned in the form of science and psychological control, whereas the third questions politics. Now, the very identity relating to memories and our perception of the world is called into question. So it's a unique approach when it comes to sequels that are renewed with each installment, with new ways to use the mechanics, and refines these common elements. Now, the contradictions, of course, here are that war is an evil that creates more monsters than it will ever destroy, but the whole point of the game is you're playing a soldier killing enemies with fetishized military hardware. So this blurs the lines between the player and the character in this meta-narrative about the nature of the individual, and truly inspired by Kojima's vision. Switching gears now to MOGs, or massively multiplayer online games. We have, much like with eSports, a new type of game and a new realm to play in. Now, these virtual worlds will host tens of thousands of players at a time, up to millions, actually, we'll discuss. They're alternate universes with their own sets of rules, social mores, and problems, as well as opportunities. And it all started at Essex University with Roy Trubshaw, here in 1978, as a fan of Dungeon, which was a port of Zork. We know that he is inspired by these type of RPG open world experiences, especially that of Crowther's Adventure, that inspired a generation of programmers like Trubshaw. Now, what Trubshaw wanted to do was create a place for people to play together, and that was the primary point of this project that he named the Multi-User Dungeon, or MUD. Now, he, of course, had to spend some time as a student at Essex, and so he partnered with Richard Bartle. So we find here he assisted, but Bartle realized that the open world with no rules or goals was impossible. You have to have something for the player to do. So he gave the MUD a structure by adding puzzles, a leveling system, a treasure, and chains that are going to mirror minor objectives that lead to larger objectives. Now, we should note that, like Adventure, this MUD was text-based. So we find that it's not visual as of yet, but it is the foundation for the true goal here of social interaction. That's what he wanted to do, is provide a place people could interact socially online. So it goes live at Essex University in 1980. Now, obviously, the progression for these types of MOGs is to represent them visually. So LucasArts did this in 1987 with their Habitat, that moved away from the fantasy archetypes to a suburban setting. They wanted to anchor it in real life. In the game, players had a third-person avatar and a broad range of possible interactions with other avatars. They can communicate, they can barter for goods, you can even rob or kill them. Now, even though the killing part was purposeful by LucasArts, they radically underestimated how bloodthirsty players actually are. And so with the beta test, they saw criminal gangs roaming the world, murdering other players and ransacking unguarded areas. The victimized players would then form their own groups and elected police chiefs, who then demanded that LucasArts grant them special in-game powers to deal with the trouble. Now, the game was too popular at the time for Quantum Link, the pre-internet service, to actually handle. A full launch, it was discovered, would crash the entire network. Therefore, it was never launched in the West to the public. The next stage in this evolution came in the 1990s, when the internet made these MOGs inevitable. Now, the first one to gain momentum in this genre was Meridian 59 by the 3DO company, released in 1996. In it, we have a fantasy setting where players would team up to fight monsters or each other. And it introduced many staples to this type of gameplay, like guild halls, an in-game bulletin board, and mail, as well as player-run guilds with voting systems. Now, the most important influence, though, it had was that it established a subscription model of $9.95 a month instead of paying by the hour or even in some cases by the minute. And it also introduced regular content expansions. The game, however, that changed perceptions of these multiplayer online games would be Ultima Online, released in 1997. And it was designed as a free-form version of this type of game, to be as free as possible, and changed drastically in response to player behavior. The famous incident that illustrates how this type of game has changed video games in general is when the creator Richard Garriott was touring his own world at the end of beta testing as Lord British, his character and one of the most important characters in the game, whereby a player then tossed a fire field spell that landed at his feet. And thinking he was invincible, he just walked into it and died. He had forgot to turn on his invincibility. So here we have the creator and one of the most central characters in the game dead. So immediately the character is surrounded by game masters, in essence the police of this world, who summon demons and monsters into the crowd. And thus, of course, they destroyed the entire square in minutes. They were so powerful. So the irony here, and if we're keeping tabs, is that he was killed in his own game. Therefore, this is the moment when the dynamic between players and developers shifts. What the creator might intend is not going to line up with what players want to do. So we find here that MOGs are not like single-player games where the team of creators makes a game and then moves on to the next. Instead, this requires an ongoing relationship because of these updates and watching what players are doing. What players want to do again don't always coincide, thus that changes what the game actually does and looks like. But it did show in Ultima Online the financial viability of big budget MOGs. It is the first one to attract over 100,000 subscribers and peaked at 250,000 in 2003. The next step in this evolution came with EverQuest of 1999, another fantasy-themed multiplayer game online, whereby players could choose from one of 16 races and explore the world of Norath, while fighting enemies and finding loot. The structural innovations introduced here would give the players a range of quests to undertake and encouraged cooperation and the formation of guilds, while limiting the player versus player battles, or PvP battles, to these designated zones. The more limited version here in EverQuest is certainly more limited than Ultima Online with regards to what players could choose to do, but it made slightly more accessible experience because of it, and led to a greater popularity with 430,000 subscribers, doubling what we saw with Ultima Online. However, the largest and most popular MOG ever was designed and refined by Blizzard, who specializes in perfecting games in these genres, not inventing them. They refined and polished the MOG genre, primarily through making it an experience that a solo player can enjoy from the start, without the hassle of knowing where to go or what to do, or just being killed by stronger players as soon as you start. So this is going to find with Blizzard dividing their servers into realms, allowing the players to select the kind of experience they wanted. So in a normal realm, we find is player versus environment, or PvE, which emphasizes cooperation. The PvP realms are, on the other hand, that being player versus player, are going to be those where anything goes, but the fight still must be consensual. They have to agree to fight one another. So players are expected at all times to act and communicate in character while playing. And the genius in the design of the World of Warcraft is that players are allowed to just play the game. In previous MOGs, they tended to have leveling curves that took huge amounts of time in order to see them progress. Here, characters level faster and tie into comprehensive quest lists that leads players onwards, so you always know where to go instead of having to figure it out and spending and wasting time. Now, also another example of this is that death in previous MOGs is going to be a big deal and very costly. So once again, you have to start over. But in World of Warcraft, the avatars recover quickly and return to battle more quickly. Another example, for instance, is that when you're away from the game for a period of time and return, you will get a resting bonus to catch you up with your friends in the experience points that they had been gaining while you were offline. So due to the comprehensive quest structure, it feels like a single-player game exploring this realm of Azeroth. And of course, it takes something that is very intimidating as a concept and instead crafts an experience that almost anyone can play and enjoy. And of course, it's challenges here that if you wanted to do something incredibly challenging for an expert player, such as go on a raid with up to 40 other players, you certainly can, but only if you want to. It becomes the most popular multiplayer online game in history and the highest grossing. As of 2014, Blizzard announced 100 million accounts. So this establishes a definitive fork in the road for this genre, and of course removed, as far as World of Warcraft is concerned, the free-form style of the original MUD as it was designed. The legacy for this type of genre continues with another game. Now, EVE Online, designed by CCP and released in 2003, is a player-driven multiplayer online game set in space, where everything takes place in a single universe, unlike that of World of Warcraft. Now, it is also unusual in that nearly every other version of this type of genre splits its player base between identical server shards, whereby only about 30 to 60,000 people are playing in your area at the same time, but there could be millions, for instance, logged on. So here we find that Tranquility is going to host everyone simultaneously. Nearly every object in the game can be constructed by the players. So for instance, you can be a miner and mine asteroids or gas fields and sell the raw materials. A dealer then can take the raw materials to the central trading hub where other players can buy the materials and construct their own ships, space stations, or anything else that they want. And you can play as any one of these characters. The players go out in ships and get into fights, for instance, and leave wrecks that are going to be salvaged by other players, and thus, of course, the cycle continues. They build their own ships, they go out, they can get into fights, they can collect the wreckage and do it again. The genius of the game is that players choose the part of the universe they want to participate in. So you could be a shipwright, for instance, and build the most complex spaceships possible and charge outrageous amounts to do so for others. Or you could be a fighter pilot working for a corporation, or a mercenary for hire, or a pirate looking for easy prey. So here you can also run a corporation and focus on long-term goals, or spy on an enemy corporation. The universe operates on mechanics and rules created by CCP, but when it comes to combat or travel, there are no developer-ordained goals or traditional endgame like World of Warcraft. The players band together to create their own goals and annex their own corner of the universe, forming alliances and fostering animosities with other groups. This is referred to by EVE players as a metagame. An example of this is in 2009, there were two large alliances in the game, one called Band of Brothers and the other is going to be Goonswarm. There's a defector that leaves Band of Brothers to join Goonswarm, and he used his administrative privileges to disband the entire Bob Alliance after stealing their assets and enormous in-game currency. Thus, a single player brought down an entire organization, leaving thousands of other members and players with nothing to do and having to start over. So we can also, for instance, be a big game hunter, and another example of setting your own goals. It is the dream of every EVE player to fly a Titan, which is the largest and most expensive ship in the game. They're enormous death machines that take 6 months of real-world time to build. An example of this type of strategy is that one Titan pilot took a break from playing for 20 months. He moved his ship and stored it in a safe place before leaving, but another player flew by and saw him and noted his name before he left the game. So once again, this player kept tabs on him, waiting for 20 months for this other player to log back in. And when he finally did, the group was waiting and ambushed him. This illustrates the links that players will go to when creating their own goals, when goals are self-created. So the future of these massive multiplayer online games is unclear because they do not have a lifespan like traditional games, whereby they are released, people play them, and then they move on. Instead, these MOGs have constant updates and visual styles that are overhauled to stay current, and they continually add mechanics and attract new players all the time. So this represents, with the World of Warcraft and EVE, the two current poles of these multiplayer online games and their design. World of Warcraft offers the ultimate structure in the game, whereas EVE, ultimate freedom. If we are to consider the future of this genre, EVE is likely going to win out, allowing players to shape their own universe and construct meaningful virtual identities for themselves. So just like The Sims and other games whereby you can create your own world and live as an avatar, we're on the verge of creating a game that is even better than life. The next class, we will wrap up this the class on the history of games and critical theory by looking at the latest developments, the latest consoles, and where gaming is going in the future.